Voices in My Head Productions presents The Legend of Purgatory Gorge. A Battletech tribute to Washington Irving's classic tale, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Written by David G. Martin. Music and sound design by John Stedman. Performed by George Ledoux. Most people would not expect for a story of any note to come out of a planet such as Mockport. Tucked away in the interior of the Federated Suns, Mockport has seen little of warfare or raiding since the days of the First Succession War. But there was one dark day when a band of pirates descended from the heavens upon Mockport, and a battle was fought for the safety of the main city. The battle, fought between the pirates and the brave men and women of the Mockport Planetary Militia, was not the sort of glorious battle that some stories will tell you about. No, this was a dirty, bloody, and sad battle, of the sort that only history books record. The militia were not hardened veterans of war, but they knew their planet well and managed to cut off the pirates' advance just short of the city, in a narrow area of land called Chesterfield Gorge. The pirates, though surprised by the militia's tactics, rallied and turned the fight into a slogging battle of inches and feet, with neither side willing to give ground. As the story goes, one pirate, the son of the captain, piloted a fearsome axeman battlemech and wielded its hatchet with deadly efficiency. So terrible and mighty was the axeman's pilot that before long the militia began to lose the battle. If not for the heroic actions of one of the two remaining militia pilots, Mockport would have lost the battle that day. Triggering his autocannon's last round, the militia pilot's shot flew true and struck the axeman in its cockpit, tearing the entire head off of the battlemech, which stopped in mid-swing in the middle of the battlefield, frozen in time at the moment its pilot left the living. After seeing this, the pirates' will to fight was broken, and they fled. The headless husk was left to stand in the gorge, alone, as a symbol of the fighting spirit of the now legendary deeds in the defense of the planet. Shortly after the battle, as nature once more overtook the gorge, healing the land after the ravages of the battle, the Axeman disappeared. Well, to say that it disappeared would be to speculate. It is more accurate to say that the giant battlemech was replaced by an oak tree standing in the middle of the gorge. No trace of the Axeman could be found, but the tree that remained in its place stood as if it had been there for 1,000 years, and so began the speculation and the mystery. Content to make up stories, the people of Mockport never thought much of looking into the matter and preferred instead to foster the legend through the telling of tales. While the details about the Axeman and its pilot varied from telling to telling, one key bit remained the same throughout the centuries, and the story was passed down. They say that on windy, moonless nights, as the wind sweeps through Purgatory Gorge and rustles the brambles and the trees, if you are lucky, you can hear the sounds of a battlemech marching up and down the gorge, the wind carrying the great whooshing sound of its hatchet as it stalks across the gorge in an endless search for its missing cockpit. Some locals say that the spirit of the pilot was trapped in the Axeman at the moment of his death, cursed to forever roam his last battlefield. Other locals say that the remains of the pilot had actually been laid to rest either at the foot of his mech, or that his comrades had made the battlemech the pilot's tomb, encasing his remains within the machine. At some point, no one knows exactly when, the name of the gorge changed to Purgatory Gorge, which better fit the setting for the strange and creepy tales that encircled the ghastly place. The legend of Purgatory Gorge along with many other minor tales of ghosts and other such otherworldly experience, have over the years grown into Mockport's own mythology, a mythology that any resident is all too ready and willing to share. Many travelers, like the man you are about to meet, have journeyed to Mockport for one reason or another over the years since the story became a legend, but very few of them have left the planet with a tale of their own to tell. Leopold Cochrane, a retired captain in the armed forces of the Federated Suns, arrived on Mockport one dreary afternoon when the sun refused to show itself and the world was getting on as well as it could. There was no fanfare to his arrival. Only a single aide awaited the dropship that carried the aging captain and his Centurion Battletech. Captain Cochrane was a spindly sort of a fellow, the kind you would expect a correctly placed stiff breeze to wisp away. Not overly tall, Cochrane was so thin that his limbs looked unnaturally longer than they really were. His demeanor was one of somber conduct, and as he walked down to greet his aide, he looked to the left and right as if expecting other greeters to leap out of the shadows and surprise him. The aide greeted the captain and welcomed him to Mockport. Cochrane demanded to be brought to the militia barracks at once in order to inspect the men that he had arrived to train. Having retired from active military duty over a decade hence, Captain Cochrane had fallen into the practice of hiring himself out on a temporary basis to smaller planetary governments with the aim of providing training and guidance to their local militia forces. Leaning perhaps too heavily on his military career, which was spent mostly on the back lines of support worlds and featured only a few light engagements, Captain Cochrane had nonetheless been able to parlay his record in good standing into that of a minor folk hero. While not dishonest in practice, Cochrane had done little to correct the backwater types who mistook his good standing and accompanying campaign pins to mean that the captain was much more of a military asset than he might have been. Regardless of how his foray into the endeavor began, Captain Cochrane was enjoying his second career, and of his time on Mockport he expected nothing but the same experience. He would spend several weeks drilling the locals, evaluating their combat skills, and advising on a program of training. If he sold it well enough, he would be hired on to carry out the program and show results to the local magistrate or governor. Captain Cochrane's introduction to the militia went as expected, with the locals suspiciously eyeing him and wondering just what he was there to do. Despite all assurances from their superiors that nothing untoward was happening, the militia of Mockport, as with most of them, welcomed the captain coolly but with a modicum of respect due his station. The training commenced, and several weeks passed as Captain Cochrane drilled with the militia, performing maneuvers and playing out small war games designed by the captain to highlight his experience and a militia's shortfalls. To say that Captain Cochrane did not deserve to sit in the cockpit of his Centurion would have been unkind, but neither was he a stellar example of a mech warrior. As with all things, Captain Cochrane relied on his depth of passable knowledge as much as a militia's lack of experience in order to appear secure in his position as instructor and teacher. It was on one such outing on patrol with a militia lance that Cochrane first encountered Purgatory Gorge. The lance leader explained to Cochrane that patrols never pass through the gorge, instead preferring to circumvent it in favor of clearer terrain. Looking into the gorge from atop a hill, Captain Cochrane indeed saw that it was mostly unfavorable terrain for standard patrolling, but he immediately came across the idea that it would serve well for a wargame setting. Musing out loud that Purgatory Gorge provided such opportunity, Cochrane's comments were met only with vague objection and an insistence that the patrol proceed past the gorge immediately. The captain thought the aversion to the gorge an odd thing, and resolved to inquire the reason why the locals wished to avoid it. Later that night, Captain Cochrane joined the militia in their nightly visit to a tavern in town and listened as they shared tales of past exploits. Some of the older denizens of Mockport were there, and their tales turned more and more towards the past as the night grew darker. Near the end of the night, one old-timer began telling the tale that Cochrane had hoped someone would tell without his asking, and he found the wait well worth the price. As he listened to the old-timer recount the legend of Purgatory Gorge, the captain soon found himself engrossed in the story. The tale thrilled Cochrane, for he had no idea that such a place existed on Mockport. The official histories of the world made no mention of the pirate raid. In fact, they mentioned nothing of note at all concerning the history of the planet, all the way back to before the Star League, so he had not looked further beyond that. Knowing that local tales, while often exaggerated, will contain bits of truth to them about the real history of a planet, Captain Cochrane knew he had a one-of-a-kind opportunity to instruct the militia in the history of warfare as well as its application. Returning to his quarters late, Captain Cochrane spent the rest of the night researching Purgatory Gorge through local databases and devising a new war game scenario to be played out the following night. By the time dawn greeted him, Captain Cochrane was busy assembling the militia, rousing them from their bunks for a briefing on their planned sortie. As they heard his briefing, the militia began to exchange nervous glances. It pleased Cochrane in a twisted sort of way to know that Purgatory Gorge made the militia so nervous. He surely had to teach the locals how to get over their backwards thinking and superstitions in order to do their jobs. There was one man in the militia's company, a young lieutenant whom Cochrane judged to be the most naturally talented mech warrior in the lot, who verbally objected to the captain's proposed exercise. The locals of Mockport viewed Purgatory Gorge as a sort of holy ground, a sacred memory of a time long ago, and none of them liked the idea of crossing into that storied land for the lowly purpose of conducting a war game. The captain, however, would hear none of this nonsense, and he waved off the young lieutenant's objections, stating that the locals needed to let go of their old superstitions and join the modern era. His briefing concluded, Cochrane excused the militia to ready their battle mechs for the evening's exercise. The tone around the militia camp was sullen the rest of the day. It was not helped by the impending storm on the horizon, which threatened to move into the area near Purgatory Gorge by that evening. When the young lieutenant again brought his concerns to Captain Cochrane, this time including an unease about the weather conditions prediction for the evening, his plea was once more waved away. The lieutenant protested only more adamantly, and it was nothing short of the captain's threat of charging him with insubordination that finally gave the lieutenant pause. As the lieutenant left, a chill ran up Cochrane's spine. The young mech warrior's fervent objections were nothing to him intellectually, but he feared that the locals' own rampant superstition for Purgatory Gorge and the story of the Headless Axeman had stuck in the back of his mind. Cochrane found himself wishing to see something more than brambles and trees out in the gorge, but just the very contemplation of that wish made him disgusted with himself. What modern man would dare believe such a tale? As the sun set on the day, the militia reluctantly set about their deployment. Captain Cochrane led the column as they marched along towards Purgatory Gorge. The storm came as predicted, and soon the captain and the militia found themselves engulfed in a deluge of lightning, wind, and raging water. Stalwart in his convictions to rid the locals of their vices, Captain Cochrane ordered the column on, and soon he led them down over the precipice, down into Purgatory Gorge. The gorge was not shielded, as Cochrane had hoped, from the worst of the storm. Instead, the wind funneled through the area, making noises against the trees and the brambles that Cochrane did not recognize, so that he had to twist his mech to the left and to the right to investigate every alien sound. As they marched further in, Captain Cochrane issued orders to the militia. They were to fan out and conduct a game of hide-and-seek, using their powered-down lasers as tagging devices. Cochrane watched as the militia battle mechs each marched out, lance by lance, into the depths of the gorge, and soon he was alone in the maelstrom. Every flash of light drew Cochrane's attention, and every rustle of the trees, heard through his battle mech's external microphone system, soon caused the captain to enter a state of heightened awareness. Soon the captain noticed that he had not heard from the militia for several minutes, and a search of his sensor display showed no contacts in the area. Had they left the gorge? Was the storm interfering with his Centurion sensors, or... No, there was nothing special about Purgatory Gorge that would cause his sensors to malfunction. The storm was simply worse than expected. Walking his Centurion several hundred yards towards the center of the gorge, Captain Cochrane finally saw a contact marker on his sensor display. He could not make out which militia battle mech was being detected, but he decided to venture towards it in order to make contact with another soul out in the gorge. The walk towards the contact was fraught with piloting obstacles. Very few paths existed that were still large enough for a battle mech to easily fit through, so Cochrane had to bat aside branches and kick away underbrush in order to make any progress. His sensor contact had not moved since he detected it, and the captain assumed that this particular pilot was lying in wait as the unit played out their game. A terrible, sudden screeching noise startled Cochrane, causing him to jerk wildly in his command chair and on his controls. The Centurion groaned as it nearly lost its balance, and Captain Cochrane saw the bare fingers of several tree branches finish their rake across his cockpit window. Admonishing himself for his moment of weakness, Cochrane righted his battle mech and marched on. His nerves still rattled, the captain attempted to steel his resolve as the storm raged outside. A flash of light, like that of a laser blast, appeared to his left, but Cochrane could see no contacts in that direction. He was now so deep in the middle of the gorge that he could see only a few feet beyond the glass of his cockpit. Another look at his sensors confirmed that his original contact had yet to move, and he set his mech back towards the blip on his screen. The lightning intensified as he neared the contact on his screen, which he noted was near the very middle of Purgatory Gorge. The cacophony of thunder overhead threatened to overwhelm his speaker systems, and Cochrane shook his head to clear his vision. As he swept aside a few final branches, his Centurion strained to push through to the center of the gorge. Alongside one final multi-lightning strike that was so loud Cochrane thought that the bolts may have actually struck his battle mech, he was at the center of Purgatory Gorge, and a battle mech stood just in front of him. Captain Cochrane could do naught but stare for several moments. Then he glanced at his sensor screen, then back out, then back to his screen, and then back out once more. His eyes were surely tricking him, he thought, for he could not be seeing what he saw. In front of him was a battle mech, just as he expected, but it was nothing like he had ever seen before. It was ancient, older than any mech he had ever laid eyes on, and it was damaged. Myomer cables hung loose through holes in the mech's armor. The rust and decay evident, this battle mech was not capable of functioning. It could not be functional, especially without its cockpit, which, it was easy to see, was missing. There was no way for the battle mech to be functioning. It would not show up on a sensor scan. It would not register a heat signature. But yet, there it was, despite all the things it could not be. Cochrane knew without a doubt that this decayed specimen was his sensor contact, though he did not fathom how it could be. Cochrane's next utterance was a yelp of surprise and terror as he witnessed the impossible. the headless axeman in front of him moved. A terrible screeching sound, like that of rending metal and snapping fiber rolled into one, overcame the sound of rain against Cochrane's hull as the right arm of the ghostly axeman flexed up and down in a motion that defied the shredded strands of Myanmar cable that dangled loosely from the phantom's hatchet arm. Cochrane could do naught but watch, transfixed as the machine came to life in front of him. Its torso twisted to the left and to the right, accompanied by a hideous sliding metal sound, like that of a set of giant shears that pressed too firmly together when closed. When the axeman finished its testing of its own parts, it turned to face Cochrane, who could only stare at where the cockpit should have been and marvel at the horror of what he now witnessed. The local stories were all true. The headless axeman haunts Purgatory Gorge after all. Fearing for his immortal soul, Cochrane turned his battlemech and drove it into the brambles, crashing through the branches and trees as he fled the specter's headless gaze. Immediately, he heard and felt the rumble of a pursuit behind him. He pushed his Centurion to an unsafe speed in order to flee from the headless ghoul, and after a half-kilometer, risked a torso twist to ascertain whether or not his stalker still loomed. Cochrane saw no visual of the axeman when he looked, and he slowly drew to a stop in a small clearing. Turning back forward, he meant to get his bearings and find an exit from the gorge, but he would not get that chance. Lightning flashed once more, and a terrible dark silhouette was highlighted in front of him. Captain Cochrane uttered a defeated gasp, slouching in his command chair, as he knew the end had found him. In a last act of defiance, he bellowed at the headless battlemech.
"Come and finish me, you cursed headless bastard!"
Cochrane tried to ready his Centurion for battle, but it was too late. The night was filled with thunder once more as fire and death belched forth from behind the headless axeman. The ghostly battlemech's jump jets began to carry it aloft, scorching the earth and plants all around it. It seemed to Cochrane as if these were no ordinary jump jets. They seemed fueled by the very fire of hell itself as they spewed their contrails behind and below the axeman, lighting the clearing with a strangely warm light which contrasted with the horror of the situation. As it leapt into the air, Cochrane was captivated by its flight, a somehow otherworldly glide that defied all the captain knew of how a battlemech was supposed to operate. As the axeman rose just above the tree line, lightning backlit the specter as it crested in its arc, giving Cochrane the impression that it was not some ghostly battlemech that came for him, but instead an avenging angel of doom and destruction, content to reap its will on the living in recompense for the great wrong it suffered in life. As the axeman landed in front of Cochrane's mech, the captain threw his head back in defiance and leveled his autocannon at his headless foe. Cochrane pressed his trigger at the same moment that the axeman's hatchet, which Cochrane now saw was raised for a strike, fell and struck the Centurion just below the cockpit, severing the head of Captain Cochrane's battlemech. Cochrane heard his own now headless battlemech still firing its autocannon as he fell toward the ground and landed with a crash, sinking into the mud on the floor of Purgatory Gorge. Leopold Cochrane knew no more. The following day, the Mockport militia conducted a search for Captain Cochrane. Following the captain's orders, they had played out their war game and proceeded to report back to base without further contact with Cochrane. It was not until the following morning's muster that the captain's absence was noticed. Only an hour of searching was required to find the captain's Centurion, face down in a muddy crater not far from the center of the gorge, one leg broken off, twisted and stuck in the mud. The battlemech's severed head was soon found several yards away, but Cochrane was not in the cockpit. An extensive search of the area turned up no body. The only evidence of a battle was the Centurion's own spent autocannon rounds, which littered the gorge floor and had torn through many of the surrounding trees and brambles. Several days later, the matter was deemed closed, and the magistrate had no choice but to declare the captain dead during a training exercise. The locals immediately began speculating what became of the captain. Some thought he had simply grown tired of his life and ended it somewhere out in Purgatory Gorge. Some believed his accident left him injured in the head, and he had yet to turn up as himself, perhaps suffering from amnesia. But the old-timers, the ones who knew the darkest parts of the old stories, they knew the real truth. The axemen had claimed Cochrane. Every one of them agreed. The captain failed to respect the land, and so the Avenger of Purgatory Gorge had taught him a lesson, dragging the poor captain into whatever hell the axeman's pilot now occupied. Some attention was paid to the young lieutenant, who the previous day had crossed with Cochrane, but the magistrate never believed a formal investigation into the lieutenant was merited. Despite this, some had their suspicions about the young officer's involvement. Some months later, a clue as to the captain's fate surfaced. During a routine audit of the spaceport manifests, it was discovered that they showed that the night of Captain Cochrane's disappearance, a civilian dropship reported that it left with one late addition to their manifest. The late addition was a passenger who paid triple the going rate to leave the planet anonymously. The tale spread quickly, and for most people, that was enough of an end to the story to fulfill what curiosity remained. Whether the old-timers were right or not, something that happened that night caused Cochrane to disappear and never come back again. Whatever Captain Cochrane's fate and the circumstances of his disappearance, the legend of Purgatory Gorge grew with Leopold Cochrane's coming and passing.
The Legend of Purgatory Gorge was written by David G. Martin. Music and sound design by John Stedman. Produced and performed by George Ledoux and Voices in My Head Productions.